All right, so hopefully everyone can still hear me. As I said, here, this is going to be a presentation on interpretive plans and the interpretive planning process and how it can work with the grant program. My name's Todd Mahon. I'm the State History Services Manager. I'm one of the content reviewers in the grant program, and I primarily look at these interpretive projects, which include interpretive plans, but also the products that come out of those, and I'll just really briefly cover those types of things towards the end, but those are things like exhibits, and it could be publications or historical markers or walking tours or whatever it is that the interpretive plan process sort of guides you towards. Generally, those are all going to be eligible things to apply for to implement that interpretation, and we can also do the research and writing of those things as well. And I'll get into those a little bit further. But here's my contact information, that will be at the final slide as well. But all of us in the Heritage Preservation Department that work on grants, we are very good at sharing and being approachable. As somebody who used to apply for grants to this program, I always found the staff willing to answer a lot of my questions, and I think we continue that today. So if you don't find what you want in this presentation, feel free to get a hold of me and then anyone else in the Heritage Preservation Department here. So here's really briefly what I want to cover today. I'm hoping that this will take about a half hour, although I didn't really practice this, so maybe it'll take 10 minutes, maybe it'll take an hour and a half now. I'm thinking it'll be about a half hour or so here. And so we're going to cover what is an interpretive plan. We're going to talk about the process of how an interpretive plan is created, and then we're going to also get into how to apply for a grant, not the nuts and bolts per se, but what parts of the application, what you should be considering when you're asking for an interpretive plan. And then I've got a slide just for some additional resources on interpretive planning, and then we'll hopefully have some questions and answer session at the end as well. So I'd also like to just encourage you in the chat feature as well, just to go ahead and, if you don't even have a question, to go ahead and just introduce yourself. It's helpful for us to know what, in sort of what you're hoping to get out of this. It's helpful for us to see what type of organizations are out there looking for. Focus on the message. That's the development of that theme and the sub themes, but also understand the mechanics in the media. And the media is just another term for the products of the exhibit. So the media might be a book, it might be an exhibit, and within the exhibit it might be the specific things of the objects that are on exhibits, or AV digital content or things like that, interactive content. So the National Association for Interpretation has these 13 benchmarks that they say are components for an interpretive plan. And so I'm not going to read these off to you, but I've sort of bolded 2 and 3, which is about that work of connecting with the audiences that are the targets of the interpretation, the people that you want the message to come to. And so it's audience analysis and civic engagement. And audience analysis is the understanding that is critical to the success of the plan, and the civic engagement is the successful interpretive plans usually include stakeholder involvement and or public input. So I'm just going to kind of go through like what the National Association for Interpretation has as its good, better, and best practices for these 2 benchmarks in an interpretive plan. So for audience analysis, at a minimum, you're going to want to use focus groups, surveys, civic engagement, and direct observation, or other methods as appropriate to assess audience needs and preferences. And you're going to want to consider audience needs and preferences in the planning process. So that's the minimum. That's good practice. And then they've got these guidelines that would to additional things that you want for better practice and best practice. So for better practice, you're going to collect and analyze visitor perception of resources and programming through informal discussion and observations of staff. Use information about visitors regularly collected by staff on data sheets and as questions asked where people are from and why people are coming to the organization. And use staff reports and other method to collect visitor data and prepare annual trend reports that can be used in planning. So this is the idea of like that this audience analysis isn't something that is done on a one-time basis and you just sort of assume that the audience is static. once you begin the process, you're going to want to sort of keep going back to the audience and seeing if they've changed, if their needs have changed, or if the content subsequently needs to be changed for those things. And then the best practice, if you're hiring an outside source, is to assign an in-house team, and every 5 years to do an analysis of visitation trends and the implications of interpretation. So these are the things that you want to really focus on in your planning for audience analysis. Next, for the civic engagement, good practice, the minimum is for that you're going to want that the interpretive planning processes are going to include at least one civic engagement opportunity. And I would definitely encourage more than one. Obviously, that's the minimum with a good practice. And a better practice is that interpretive planning process includes one or more opportunities for key stakeholders and audiences to have input and to review the plan document. And then the best practice is that the drafts and final interpretive master plan are available to the stakeholders through varied means. So the people that were part of the process get a chance to see what the final product was. And again, like, there's a lot of ways to do these civic engagement opportunities, or, you know, you can call them a lot of things. I mean, focus groups or community conversations. And I think those moderated focus groups and community conversations are really a lot of the best ways to do this. And a talented moderator can really get a group, can sort of tease out the ideas of what do they want in the interpretation and what do they find that's important to the community that they want to learn more about. And so those are the things that can come out in that process. So if you want to apply to our grant program for an interpretive plan, there's our grants admin staff can definitely fill you in more on the process. I'm not going to take you through how to set up an account or any of that, but you can go to the grants webpage, which is you can see it there, mnhs.org/preservation/legacy-grants. Also, if you just go to mnhs.org, you can see the this orange preservation tab, and once you open that up, you can find legacy grants. And so this stuff here in the red will help you, that is circled in the red, is where you can find out how to set up an account in our grants portal. The grants manual, which is a very important thing. The grants manual is something that I would advise anybody that's even thinking about applying for a grant to take a look at the grants manual. Our grant program can fund a lot of things, so it's a very large grant manual that has information about how to do historic preservation projects and collections conservation projects and collections management, and then interpretive projects. And so that sort of tries to fit into all of it. And so you can download the PDF and say, oh my Lord, it's 150 pages. Really, the first 30 to 40 pages are focusing on getting your application together, or getting your account set up and things like that, and general things that are applicable to all the grants about hiring and procurement. But then you're just going to want to look for essentially the chapter that's on your project. And so for interpretation, there's an interpretive programs section of the manual, so you can find that. So I would definitely encourage everyone to check that part out as well. Okay. So when you are going through, like, the application is the same for no matter what type of project you're applying for. And so they have all got a section for the budget, the project description, the need and rationale, project personnel, work plan and timetable, and sustainability. And so when you are working on the budget, acceptable line items for the budget would include the cost of a planner if you're hiring a planning firm, an interpretive firm for this, their costs, costs for meetings, rental of facilities, things like that. That's an appropriate thing. Printing costs, possibly honorariums, if there are people that you feel like you need to provide an honorarium for them to be there, which can be a very important thing to get some underrepresented communities at these things. So those are all appropriate things that you could include in your budget. Basically, the budget is everything that you want the grant project to pay for, that should be in your budget. The project description is, what are the components of the final product? So you're going to want to describe what you want to accomplish with the plan, but you're also going to talk about all of these things are projects that have products. And so the final product for this is the interpretive plan. And so in the project description area, you're going to want to describe the components that you want in that in the interpretive plan. And so those are the things I'll just really quickly bounce back. So those are these types of things. So tell us that you're going to develop interpretive themes and sub-themes, that you're going to do an inventory of the historic resources and those things. And then also you're going to want to describe, well, what is the process that we're going to go through to plan it? We're going to do surveys. We're going to do 3 focus groups, one with community elders, one with K through 12 or 5th grade school teachers or whatever. Describe what these groups are and who they are, and when you're going to meet with them. And then you're also going to want to make sure that you confirm with us that you're going to follow standards. And so we use the National Association for Interpretation for the standards for interpretive plans. And so you're going to want to confirm that that's what you work on. For the need and rationale, I always describe this as this section, regardless of what you're applying for, is why this project and why now. And so if you're coming to us for an interpretive plan, there's a lot of good reasons to be doing an interpretive plan. You maybe have moved into a new building, or you're moving into a new building, and so that's going to change the way that you're telling the stories. Maybe there's a community anniversary coming up. It's the county sesquicentennial, or in 2026 we've got the US 250, the Hester Centennial, I think it's called, or the semi-quincentennial. So you can write that down. So it could be things like that, or if you've gone through with your organization a strategic planning process, and that in the work plan you've identified that there is a need to develop a interpretive plan. Those are all great things to include in the need and rationale. It says that this is why you're doing it, and this is why it's the time to do it, and also demonstrates that you've put some thought and planning into it, and that this isn't just sort of a kind of a flight of fancy or anything like that. Project personnel. This depends on if you're going to be hiring a firm, which is a very common thing for grantees and grant applicants to ask for. So the firm, and so you would identify the firm that you're going to hire for it, or if you're going to hire the firm or any of the project personnel afterwards, which is something that's up to you. You can hire before you're applying, or you can hire after. The work cannot begin until after the grant is done, but you can do that before or after. You just have to follow our procurement process, which is something that our grants admin staff can help you with in more detail. But in the project personnel, you're going to want to describe who is hired and what their skill set is, or if you haven't hired them yet, talk about the skill set that you're looking for. And so a great thing to include with that, if you haven't hired yet, is to include the RFP, the request for proposal, or a draft of a job posting and job description for the project personnel part. And so the work plan and timetable, that is where you can describe parts of the project description and put some more detail of when it's going to happen. So when are the public input sessions going to be? What's the schedule for this? And I think the best way to do this is to just sort of say week 1 to week 3, we're going to go through the process of hiring the firm or whatever, or we're going to have our first meetings with the firm where they're going to talk to us about expectations and things like that. And then in week 6 is meeting number 1, week 7 is meeting number 2, etc. And then and week 8 or 10 or whatever the schedule is when initial drafts will be given from the contractor to the organization, and time for feedback on that. So that's the type of things that we look for in the work plan and timetable. Essentially what this does is it shows to us like how reasonable that you are being with this, and so we can assess the quality of the plan that you have for the project that you're applying for. And then there's sustainability, and then I would use that section to describe the organization's plan to implement the recommendations of the plan. So this, as we've described and you've hopefully come to understand, the interpretive plan is a series of recommendations that come out of this process of working with the community and understanding the resources of the museum to come up with suggestions or priorities for ways to tell these stories based on the themes that are developed. And so in this section, you want to describe to us how you feel you can carry out that work. And you can certainly describe that you would intend to come back to the grant program for applications to implement the recommendations of that. And that's generally something that we would be very interested in. So you might sort of be asking yourself, well, where does this fit into all of this? And the interpretive plan is really kind of at the beginning of, well, not kind of, it is at the beginning of the interpretive process. And so we've got this diagram here that talks about how you can at first apply for the interpretive plan. And then, so the green is the applications, and then the blue is doing the work of a funded project. So that's the developing of the interpretive plan. So after you've identified the sub-themes and it says that you want to do exhibits with it, then you might sort of say, okay, so if it's, back to that Minnesota River example that I had earlier, you might say, well, we know generally the stories, we've got the themes that we know, but we realize that, we don't know enough about the Dakota on the Minnesota River, or we don't know enough about farm technology. And so we need to do some research on that. So it's perfectly reasonable and acceptable to apply for research. And we can definitely down the line do webinars about how research projects can work with the grant program. That's definitely something that you can talk to me about. John Fulton in our grants office also does a lot of work with some of the research applications as well. So we can describe that process. And then you can also use the grant program to actually write the content. So if it's an exhibit, to write the exhibit script and to do an exhibit plan, which would select the objects for it using the themes that are from the interpretive plan. So that's acceptable. And then you can also come to us to actually what we describe as implementing the interpretation. So building the exhibit and installing it. If you're doing historical markers, fabricating the markers and installing them. If it's a book that you're doing, publishing it. You'll see this big bright red line here, and you might wonder, well, what's that there for, Todd? Well, that's there because these things on the front end you can apply if you want to in one grant. I wouldn't necessarily advise it, but you certainly could. But you cannot combine any of these things with an application to implement. And the reason for that is we apply historical standards when looking at implementation. And so an application to put in an exhibit or to install a historical marker, it has to come with the finished text, the exhibit text or the marker text, along with 2 letters of critical review. And so those things have to be done for that application. So you'd have to, if you want to use grant funds, you would have to apply for those previously, and then just as importantly, have those previous projects closed and approved with their final reports before you can apply to do the subsequent work that is built on top of those foundational things like the interpretive plan, the research, or the writing. So we're wrapping up here. Here's the resources that I used in part to put this together. I'm happy to share this for anybody that isn't quick on writing down. And there's a slide that's coming up, but I can go back to this slide at any point too. So I make particularly great use out of National Association for Interpretation and their standards that they have. And then I find that John Viverka's outline for an interpretive plan is one that I have referred others to, and that I make use of myself when I'm brushing up on this. So that's it for the prepared presentation here, about 30 minutes as I'd hoped for. So I'm going to switch out of the presentation mode here, the slides, and then if there are questions, we can address those. So give me a moment to slip out of the slides here.
I guess I have a question about, you guys mentioned that at MNHS you guys can do the interpretive plan writing. Do you guys also offer services for content, developing the content?
Well, I want to be clear, and I'm not sure if I'm misunderstanding, like we're not going to do an interpretive plan writing for you. Like even if you had a grant, you would not be able to hire the Minnesota Historical Society to do that. So I'm not sure if that's what your understanding if that's what the question is. But if it's just about can the grant program fund the other pieces, the writing and the research, yes, it absolutely can. So if you develop an interpretive plan using the grant program, or even if you just have an interpretive plan that was done outside the grant program, you can definitely come to us to do the research or the writing for it, and the implementation of it, the publishing or the fabrication of the exhibit. Is that the question that you had? Did I answer it?
Yeah, I thought earlier in the presentation you said something that MNHS, you guys maybe have staff there that do interpretive plan, like write interpretive plans for other organizations. I thought I heard you say that, but I might have misunderstood that.
There are firms out there that provide that service. We have something on our website called the Preservation Specialist Directory. It's kind of a yellow pages, as it were, of a lot of the people that can do the work that the grant program accomplishes, including interpretive planners. But also on there are conservators and people that can do tuck pointing on a National Register building and that type of work. So there are a handful of firms in Minnesota that do interpretive plans and planning. And and they do very good work and have successfully done work on behalf of grantees. So I would encourage you to go there, and definitely if you need some assistance on figuring out, like, we don't make recommendations for this, but we can help you sort of figure out a little bit of like who's done work on similar types of projects in the past.
Okay, thank you.
And we have a question from Brad here. So he's asking, what is the approximate timeline from grant submission to approval of funding? And so for a small grant, it's going to take about 2 months for you to hear if you got the grant, and then it might be another month after that before you get the first check. Or for a small grant, you're going to get the entire check. For a large grant, it's about 5-month process. So, if you're applying to the large round in May, you're probably going to find out in November, let's say, and your start date might be either December 1st or January 1st for a large grant if you get it in the next round.
So Wayne's got Wayne Ganaway at Olmsted County is, can a small grant feasibly cover the cost of an interpretive planning process? That's a difficult question to assess. I would say probably not, although it depends on a couple of things. So I would definitely begin talking to some interpretive planners that you could find on the Preservation Specialist Directory about what your needs are. And they're really the ones that would help you determine the cost. I would say that we don't very often see an interpretive plan come in for less than $10,000. I've seen them, but most of them are in the $25,000 to $40,000 range, and that's not all of them, but I would say that's just anecdotally most of them. But we have seen organizations come and do phases of a interpretive plan through us, that they might do the audience analysis portion with a small grant, and then do the thematic development with an additional small grant after the first one is closed. But you would have to do those sort of sequentially. You wouldn't be able to, for instance, in the same small grant round, apply for different portions of the same interpretive plan, one that's the audience analysis and ones that is the thematic development, because that's a sort of false segmenting of it that sort of gets it under the under $10,000, so that it doesn't go into the more competitive large round. And also with some of the dollar amounts at different thresholds, there's some more financial reporting that's required. So you wouldn't sort of be able to get it under $10,000 just to avoid some of the financial reporting that's required. I don't know, that might have been more answer than there was question.
So what I heard you say, Todd, is that the only usually the only way a small grant could cover the cost of an interpretive plan would be if it was sort of organically broken into at least like two pieces.
Yeah.
And get
That
those.
said, I mean, I have seen, I think even in recent rounds, an application for an interpretive plan that was for $10,000. It was for a smaller, a narrowly focused plan and area of focus. So yeah, it's possible. But I would definitely, I always encourage people to be talking to potential vendors ahead of time so that they can get a reasonable idea of what the costs are. As I said earlier in the presentation, you don't have to hire before. You don't have to know who you're hiring beforehand. But I find a lot of advantage to knowing that before you apply. It gives you a good number for your budget. You still have to go through the procurement process. Everyone should have a fair opportunity to bid on your project. But I think there's a lot of good reasons to do that before you apply.
All right.
You know, like one thing I didn't talk a lot about in the presentation, but I'm just sort of scanning through some of the comments here and I'm seeing is the idea of, you know, who might want an interpretive plan. And definitely you can do that at the organization level, you know, a county historical society or a city or county park or something like that. And I think, like, you know, with city and county parks, it's like this interesting thing where they're, you know, they might be covering a larger sort of area. And I guess what I'm getting at with this is there's a lot of great opportunity in there to do an interpretive plan for something outside, to partner with a neighbor or something like that to do a joint interpretive plan. We've seen, we have a partnership program, which this would definitely be appropriate for, but you could also just do it through the regular grant program, where we've seen different property owners that are telling the same story that they've come together to do an interpretive plan. They own different parts of a resource, like a historic district or something like that. And I often think about how, like, a county in southeast Minnesota, like, you know, like in some ways, like there's this story of southeast Minnesota that they kind of want to tell in a broader way and then focus on their section of it, their county borders. But you know, counties that are together in a corner of the state to get together and sort of say, like, we want to do an interpretive plan for southeast Minnesota, you know, as an example or something like that. So there's a lot of great opportunity for that. And you know, even just like cities and units of government, like an interpretive plan is a great thing that they can use as a way to communicate what the needs are of their community. So even if they're, you know, if there's a city water issue or something like that coming up, to have an interpretive plan for your city is something that you can do as well, so that you can understand, like, well, what's a way that we can present and make some changes on these needed things. Well, I think we're running out of questions. I think what I'm going to do is I'll stay on for a while until I see that, you know, everyone has left. But just to encourage everyone to know, like, that there's lots of information available on the grants website. So you can just find it at mnhs.org and then go to the preservation tab and you'll be able to find the grants page that way. Things to know about for the deadlines: there are quarterly deadlines for the small grant rounds, which are the ones that are $10,000 and less. Next one coming up is on January 10th. They're always the second Friday of January, April, May, excuse me, January, April, July, and October. And then the large round, which is projects that are more than $10,000, that's just offered once a year. Next year in 2020, the pre-application deadline, the pre-application is required. There's no pre-application with the small ones. The pre-application deadline is in late May, and I'm blanking on the exact dates, but you can find that info on the website. Pre-application is in late May, and then there's a final application where you'll get comments back from content reviewers like me or whoever is assigned your project, and those are designed to improve it. And so the final applications are due in early July.
Todd had mentioned the partnership program, and the deadline for that is January 24th. And of course, it's a whole different program with different requirements, but I do think it's a good way for, you know, something like a joint interpretive plan. It could work very well for a partnership.
Yeah, last year, just as an example, the Dodge County Historical Society and some I'm blanking if it was the city or the county, that they together own some different resources for a historic district. So they came together doing an interpretive plan. And, like, this is something that can tell each of them how they're going to interact with to tell a shared message. And I think it's a great thing that they put together.
Well, it looks like we're losing people. It was a good crowd today. Good topic, and we will get it posted. Toot sweet. The recording, that is.